Welcome back from lunch. And for those of us who are joining us online, welcome to the Merchant Acquiring Conference in 2024. We've had a great session so far today. Thank you for all of your participation. It's been a very interactive day. I'm very pleased and honoured to be joined by a really great group of payments professionals to talk about orchestration. It's a topic which generates a lot of enthusiasm and interactivity. So got some questions sort of internally within the panel, and then we'll chuck it out to the floor for your questions. Just for the benefits of the people that have joined online, my name's Chris Jones. I'm the Managing Director at PSE Consulting. Do you want to move down the line, Tom?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Tom Voaden. I'm the VP of Commercial at Br-dge, and we're an orchestration platform, and my role is looking after our sales and partnerships efforts.
James Lloyd. I'm leading international for a payment infrastructure company called JUSPAY. We for sure provide orchestration and other value-added service to merchants. We also work with some large global banks and card schemes.
And I'm Chris Uriarte. I'm a partner at Glenbrook Partners. We're a payment strategy consulting firm. We work with all sorts of folks in the payments ecosystem, from big banks to merchants and service providers like these guys as well.
So you're bookended by Chris's.
Yeah.
Right. So orchestration, we'll maybe start with the basics. Be good to get everybody's definition of what you regard as an orchestration platform. Tom, maybe again for you, given your job is explaining what your company does, how would you define orchestration? Where would you say it began and ends?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, when we're selling in the market, we're coming up against all different types of companies who are calling themselves orchestration. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer, and I think what we see is that different types of customers need different types of orchestration. We see as orchestration as being very kind of pure play technology layer that's independent, that's gateway agnostic, and that literally is that kind of piece of middleware that sits between the customer and the downstream payment stack. However, I mentioned we're coming up against other types of orchestrators or companies that are saying they're orchestrators. We see gateways who offer routing. We see kind of full stack, new challenger acquirers also offering some facets of orchestration. Again, I don't think any of them are right or wrong, but as I say, we see orchestration as being that pure software play.
James, your views?
Yeah, listen, I tend to agree with Tom. I mean, I think certainly, I think agnostic. I agree. I mean, there are a multitude of orchestrators in the market. Some of them are, for want of a better term, basically commercial propositions where it's basically a kind of a if this, that, then type model. I wouldn't say they're technically very deep or advanced. I think, as Tom mentioned, there are others who are a bit more kind of technology focused. I probably, the only thing I'd add is, again, for us operating as we do on the merchant side, bank side, scheme side, I'm not sure we see orchestration even as a kind of fully baked product in itself, let alone a business in itself. I think at a certain point, the market is the highest, the largest, most sophisticated merchants can effectively build smart routing capabilities themselves. Folks at the smaller merchants typically don't require that type of smart routing orchestration. So you have a middle rump, if you like, of merchants for whom it's beneficial. But I do suspect, and we think that market will perhaps even contract over time as they better understand the dynamics and what can be built with a kind of a proper engineering function. So we think it's important, obviously. But equally, I suspect the future of orchestration will be layering value-added services on top of that, and maybe that's something we can get into later.
Yeah, we'll pick up on that point. But Chris,
yeah, I think the one thing where we all agree is the term's been very much used and abused across the industry in many different ways, and we see a lot of legacy players that we saw one legacy player this year that probably everybody knows in the room rebrand their gateway platform as the world's largest orchestration platform.
Yeah.
You probably know who I'm talking about. And that just adds a little bit more to the confusion around the term, I think. But, we've kind of tried to put together a framework for what orchestration looks like across the landscape. And usually what we see providers sort of on the most basic end that are offering what we would call sort of table stakes functionality, which is the basic things that we would consider to be in all platforms. Single API access to multiple acquirers and routing between those acquirers really to start with, but then quickly ramps up to more advanced functionality around maybe transaction enrichment, actually going in and enhancing the data in the transaction for better performance reasons, perhaps to ensure that you're getting best economics and complying with card network rules, things along those lines, all the way up to the smart routing example where you're making really good informed decisions around who you should route to, when you should route to them, what dependencies you have between different, not just acquirers, but fraud service providers, tokenization providers, vaulting providers, et cetera, how you make all this work together. So, we're really seeing this broad spectrum of functionality that exists. So, what we say to folks is you really have to ask the questions and peel back the layers of the onion as to what somebody means when they say we're doing orchestration.
Sounds good. Just, James, picking up on your point on, despite perhaps the breadth of definition that's applied, orchestration's been around for a little while now, and any business in the payments world has to evolve to survive. You mentioned this challenge of adding value. So particularly for orchestration platforms, in a world where there are a fair number of players out there and they need to differentiate themselves not only against the peer group, but also other participants who claim the right to the label. How will orchestration players continue to add value in a competitive world?
Yeah, I mean, look, and I'm certainly not trying to diminish the importance of orchestration. I just think it's going to be, it is, as you say, a competitive market. And I think it's important for merchants who can pretty quickly determine who's got what capability. And what I mean by that in terms of value add is, I mean, we're probably not very well known to folks in the audience because a lot of the base is in Asia right now, but we've got 1,100 people, 1,000 of whom are engineers, right? So we're typically building pretty scalable, payment infrastructure services for the Amazons, Googles of this world, et cetera. So for us, orchestration is, okay, we're going to facilitate some of these typically multi-region complex clients to, of course, do all the, let me call it table stakes items that Chris mentioned, but equally, what are the actual pain points we can look to solve? And that's what I talk about value-added services. End-to-end reconciliation continues to be not a very sexy topic, but a tremendously important one to large merchants. So we think that's something whereby once you have some level of visibility across the various, the gateways, the acquirers, the APMs, et cetera, you can begin to solve for some of that. I would say the other item that we spend a lot of time on is around cost observability, right? I mean, by which I mean we're ingesting a lot of, whether it's the ever-changing scheme, information dynamics, pricing, et cetera, and just providing actionable insights to clients to say, not just we've enabled your ability to orchestrate or to smart route on this basis, but we're providing you on a per transaction, per day basis, the kind of cost visibility such that you know what you're paying for with what card or what APM, with what provider, and you can kind of manage accordingly. So I think there's more like that we can speak to, but I guess my point would be, and I think it's true of a couple of other players in the industry, they recognize this is a kind of an evolving space, and perhaps the multitude of competitors we see today may not necessarily be in the same shape in kind of 2 or 3 years' time.
Tom, it'd be good to get your views on that sort of value add question.
I think it's, back to that first kind of answer I gave, I think to play in the side of orchestration, which is being that independent technology layer, you are an added cost. You're an added kind of integration as well for the customer, be that a merchant, or in our case, we also have some acquiring and white label customers. I think that's got to make sense. And I know that's an obvious thing to say, but only in certain types of merchants and entities does that make sense. So we see, for example, that in the enterprise space, it does make sense because you probably have specific infrastructure problems that you're trying to solve, and a flexible software-led orchestration platform can plug some of those gaps, and it's a lot cheaper to buy than build in most cases. I think when we look at the acquiring landscape that we serve, a lot of acquirers are losing market share to those new entrants. buying at least some facets of orchestration capability and offering those out to your customers in a white label way, again, can enable you to retain customers, grow your base, offer new services that you can monetize, again, in a way that's cheaper than building and quicker to market as well. So I think from our side, what we're really trying to do, and what we're seeing some of our competitors do as well, is start to really offer a kind of modular approach where, we have some customers who just use us for independent network tokenization plus data. We have some that use us just for routing, and we're not even sending the transaction onto the processor for them. We're literally just telling them where to send it. So it's the ability to plug those specific gaps. I think that's where it can add real value, rather than trying to be all things to all people, because that's really tricky. And just the last point I would make is that, what else we're seeing is the kind of verticalization on the merchant side. So, we've got competitors who clean up in the airline space, and that's because they're really honing their product and connectivity for that space. I think that's where additional value can be added as well, is when you get a really well-rounded proposition that's specific to certain verticals. There's a ton of value in that.
Chris, any more to add?
I think I'll just add that what we're seeing is some of the smarter providers in this space are doing a good job at taking that cost or that perception that orchestration is just another cost and turning it into more of an ROI conversation, whether that's by adding in smart routing capabilities or things along those lines, saying that, listen, you can get the benefit of what we bring to the table with all this great functionality that we've described, but you could also fund it through this functionality that we're bringing to you as well. So those folks, I think, that maybe don't have the more mature stacks are finding some of the challenges that we're describing here, where people are saying, listen, I'm already being squeezed for costs on a per transaction level. Do I really need to add just another one there? And then you're really just getting into a question about build versus buy versus maybe some of these other value adds that could be put into that equation.
Chris, if I can add to that, just to be vaguely contrarian, I mean, in fact, we completely agree to the point that we've actually open sourced an orchestration service for the UK, Europe, and the US, which we call Hyperswitch, on the basis that, it's kind of a largely solved problem, again, at a basic level, right? As I say, value-added services are a little bit different, but in terms of providing you that connectivity across all of the myriad integrations, providing you, the front-end means by which you can set logic, rules, be it, commercial commitments, et cetera, et cetera. At a technical level, this is actually not tremendously challenging, to be perfectly frank, especially if you're coming from a kind of an engineering background. So, we feel confident enough having open source that, but again, it comes back to, okay, the so what, right? I mean, is this proving its value? And that's where, as I say, we see the kind of continuing evolution of what are the add-ons or what are the true differentiators associated with that.
I mean, Tom, you mentioned the point of who you serve. Right? I think the traditional orchestration model is that you go to, merchants, slightly more complicated merchants who don't have the engineering resources to build it themselves, to James's point. So that's the kind of traditional model. But there's also the model which you mentioned, which is to go to gateways and acquirers who perhaps don't have technology forward front doors, that would like to be able to go to their merchant with exactly your proposition of, that new technology layer, good documentation, better rules to manage the transactions, etc. In terms of that balance of going to merchants versus servicing the traditional PSP community, where do you see that balance settling? Is it which one's more important?
Yeah, it's interesting for us because we started off by just going for merchants and obviously working with partners on the kind of gateway and acquiring side, because obviously without the connectivity, orchestration doesn't really exist. What we observed was actually a lot of what we were doing when we were servicing kind of enterprise scale merchants was plugging gaps that their own PSPs, acquirers, service providers couldn't offer themselves. So that could be as simple as just having a modern front end, being able to offer some fairly basic APMs, some simple routing and failover functionality, all the way through to much more complex challenges that these merchants were having. Now, often what we see is that merchants actually, they've chosen their acquirers for a reason, they want to stay with them. And that might be based on cost, it might be because they business bank with certain large-scale acquirers, whatever it may be. They don't necessarily want to move their acquiring volume away, but what they're struggling with is technology. And orchestration can sit in the middle. Now, the flip side of that is working with acquirers and PSPs, they always see orchestration as a little bit of a threat. And it's fair enough. I mean, it is a way for volume to be shifted away from them. Our argument to that is always, well, it's just based on your performance. And if the merchant, ultimately is going to shift away from you, they probably are going to anyway. We're not influencing that. We're just giving them a holistic data view and the ability to do it if they wish. But actually, that is a challenge in itself. So what we then started to see was a number of acquirers and PSPs, typically the more legacy players, but some who own fairly large shares of the market, start to say, this is great, because actually my merchants are able to get more of what they want. And they're able to get the technology that we're not able to offer them. But we feel a little bit out of control with that, because it's being provided by someone else when we're not really in the picture. So we had a number of acquirers and PSPs who came to us and said, we'd like to take certain bits of that technology. And again, it might just be a new modern front end to sit in front of the multiple gateways that you've got as an acquirer, or it might be just to offer routing as a service. Could be network tokenization, or it could be kind of full 360 orchestration. But we started to notice some of our partners coming to us and saying, we want to start taking this. For us as an orchestrator, that's fantastic, because it means that we're not having to go through the hard yards of selling directly to merchants. It opens up new kind of revenue streams and new customer bases, such as SMB, who we'd never served directly because it doesn't make sense for us. But actually, if it's being done by a kind of intermediary partner who's managing all of the customer onboarding and all that kind of stuff, then great. So I think from our side, we'll continue to service both. But ultimately, the real large long-term opportunity I see in orchestration is in that kind of white label space.
Mm-hmm. James?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with everything Tom was saying there. I think, look, I myself came most recently from a global transaction bank on the kind of merchant services, merchant acquiring side. And, I certainly had a strongly held view that banks would actually be best placed ultimately to provide orchestration services in a ways, because typically if you're in a transaction bank, what you most care about is the settlement, right? I mean, actually the kind of acquiring piece or even the front-end orchestration is just a means to an end, which is a little bit different, right, for a monoline acquirer or whatever else. So what that means in practice is, I agree with Tom that I think a lot of the opportunity there is to serve some of those banks, but I think you need to find those banks, how can I say, that have a appreciation of what they're good at and perhaps what they're not so good at. And for many banks, frankly, what they're not so good at is building tech. I mean, this is not a controversial point. So, in fact, if I'm to give the example, although I don't want to front run an announcement, I mean, we built a kind of an end-to-end solution for a top 10 global bank, whereby they were re-entering merchant services. Again, this will be announced in the next month or so. Re-entering merchant services, they understand the benefits in terms of them owning the relationship, managing the relationship, ensuring the settlement flows, et cetera, but also had an appreciation for us to compete at an enterprise level with an Adyen, or at an SMB level with some of the, even the PayFacs that were mentioned by Luke earlier. We need to be realistic about what we can do, and therefore, we came in and built the whole, full stack solution, frankly, from orchestration, acceptance, gateway, processing, end to end. And I think for me, obviously that's a happy, marriage. The challenge will then be with existing banks who have some of those components. And again, to Tom's point, you need to have a sufficiently modular approach to say, look, you've got a processing partner, we don't need to replace that. Or perhaps you've got a couple of gateways with whom you want to work. But it's stitching that together with a stack that is competitive, to be brutally frank. I mean, because many of the banks are just not competitive at any level, right? So that's a big opportunity, but it's a longer sales cycle, and therefore, to answer your question in a long-winded manner, I think the merchant piece is important. I think the bank and partner piece is important, but actually more than anything, they're kind of self-reinforcing as well.
Yeah, the feedback loop. And Chris?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm in agreement that a lot of orchestration providers can provide a lot of value, especially to legacy banks, legacy bank acquirers, but I'll kind of take a different angle of this. I'm not sure a lot of the providers are really ready to do that.
Yeah.
If we look at the landscape of providers that are out there in the orchestration space, these are small players in general, right? Organizations that are still really more in startup mode, 50, 100, 150 employees. And I've worked for an acquiring bank. I have sold into acquiring banks for many years, and I'll tell you that acquiring banks are terrible customers to have. They're really demanding customers, and the expectation is going to be that you are going to have to respond to their needs and their roadmaps and things like that quickly, while you also have other parts of the market to service, right? And you're thinking more from a strategic perspective for maybe what do merchants want, sort of from a bigger picture, but then you're going to have this demand for a large global bank, maybe in the cases that we're talking about. So, I think there are challenges in the industry, in the orchestration space altogether, about small startup-y type orchestrators, which tend to make up a lot of this space right now, servicing these type of enterprises.
And if I can say, like when I was with a global bank and we diligenced a bunch of these players, I mean, frankly, you find that to be the case, right? I mean, you kind of look under the hood. It's not just orchestration, by the way. It's open banking. It's myriad. It's myriad services whereby you have a lot of startups, which are great. But as a bank, obviously and rightfully, you need to take a very risk-weighted approach to this. I mean, do I want to put all our eggs in the basket of a business that has tremendous key man risk, that the financials perhaps are not exactly robust, et cetera, et cetera? So, in fact, that's where we see a little bit of the opportunity is, we don't think acquiring banks are terrible customers as long as they understand, again, what they're good at and what they're not. And that is a delta, because frankly, they're under tremendous competitive pressure. So I think there is a little bit of a waking up to, well, maybe we can't build everything ourselves, and certainly maybe we can't even build most of it ourselves. We still want to control it, we still want to maintain it, et cetera. But I guess my summary there, and I agree with both of my fellow panelists, is I suspect if we're on the stage here in 3 years, let alone 5 years, the makeup of the industry will be quite different, as too will be the offerings from large heritage banks, which I heard someone say as opposed to legacy earlier, heritage banks, and monoline acquirers. I think there will be a little bit of a convergence in terms of that best case scenario.
We're at the time. We've got a couple of minutes for questions from the audience, if anybody's got any. I'll chuck a microphone over there.
People at home can't see that every hand in the room went up, but
Hi, everyone. One thing we found with a few clients is, with orchestration has been its e-commerce sort of focus, particularly, acquirers and, want to get rid of base 24 or Postilion or something like that. The enterprises do, at least. What that piece, which is the sort of missing piece, and also if you look at the new PayFac, a very high proportion of the PayFacs out there are e-commerce as well. How do you see that sort of mixture of events and there being a slight gap in what the orchestration sector offers?
Yeah, we were just talking about this yesterday. In fact, there is definitely a gap in the market for, what I would consider to be true omni-channel orchestrators. You see most of the orchestration platforms we're talking about today are very e-commerce focused for sure. You do see in the card present space, companies that are offering transaction hub type products that will do different types of routing in the spirit of orchestration. But generally the offerings are very different. They're sort of of the same vein, but they're a little bit apples and oranges. So, I'm not sure that there is sort of a true leader out there for omni-channel orchestration, but what you do see probably organizations like yourself, James, coming in, doing more customized type. We have worked with enterprise merchants or enterprise banks that do have sort of internal custom developed orchestration platforms that are handling both card present and card not present traffic at the same time. So definitely a gap. Might be a bit too much for somebody to bite off as a single product. I'm not sure.
I mean, I agree. I think, look, the complexity isn't quite there in the offline space as it is in online in terms of the myriad payment types and so on. So I don't think it's necessarily a like for like, but certainly, we've been supporting some clients in terms of kind of integrated reporting, for example. I mean, that's a relatively straightforward way of saying at least we've got a kind of common view of that omni-channel solution. Similarly, you are seeing, least cost routing for debit, whether it be in the US, Australia, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I would be loath to say that you can just translate kind of e-commerce orchestration into the offline. I don't think that's the case. But an integrated offering is absolutely important for high-end luxury, a lot of retail clients, and I think you need to have an offering for sure in order to compete.
I think just to add to that from our side, so we do go to market nearly entirely on e-commerce, especially on the merchant side. We're seeing merchants very actively, run separate RFP processes for orchestration and the kind of face-to-face piece in the knowledge that no one has really nailed it yet, and we would put our hands up and say that. I think the flip side of that is back to the white label piece. That's where we are starting to dabble in kind of omni-channel. The reason being because some of these acquirers and companies that we're partnering with in that space already have their own face-to-face offering. And now back to James's point, we can offer some fairly basic stuff there in terms of tying together the payment data, some more basic level routing, the ability to tokenize cards in the omni-channel environment. So it's more like kind of, again, plugging specific gaps in the face-to-face space. But it's really in the white label part of our business that we're seeing that come kind of to the fore.
I'm aware we've run out of time and there's still a packed agenda for the rest of the day. So I'll wrap up by saying thanks very much, guys, for your insights. And I'm sure there'll be plenty more questions later on in the day. So thanks
for having us. Thank you.
Thank you.